This is one of the brightest stars in the sky. Betelgeuse. But now it's on its deathbed. A cosmic war that's lasted millions of years is ending. Soon, unable to withstand its own weight, it'll collapse in seconds. This collapse will turn into a massive shockwave, and the star will scatter its entire being, every atom across space. But this isn't an extinction, it's a new beginning. This is a star's most magnificent farewell. Supernova. This story, hundreds of light years away, actually concerns us closely. Because from the atoms in our brains to the iron in our blood, many things formed in the hearts of stars like Betelgeuse billions of years ago. So there's such a deep connection between us and the universe. Actually, modern science doesn't deny this bond either, but it describes it not with emotions like we do, but rather with measurable signs. And these measurements can sometimes point to that inevitable truth we'll all experience. Yes, as you've guessed, I'm talking about death. Even today, science defines death in an extremely mechanical way. Just like a computer being unplugged. A heart stops, breathing ends, and blood flow to the brain is cut off. Deprived of oxygen, brain cells collapse erratically and gradually, and consciousness slowly darkens and vanishes like a flickering light bulb going out. A cold, mechanical, and definitive end. But is it really like that? Or has our understanding of the dying process slowly begun to change? I mean, are there some things that can't be explained outside of this mechanical definition? You know, I'm talking about phenomena like that famous light at the end of the tunnel, or life flashing before your eyes like a movie reel. For a long time, science defined all of these as a hallucination or the brain's final reflexes. However, an event that occurred in a hospital's intensive care unit in 2022 led to all these ideas changing, or let's not say changing, but being shaken. The event even received wide coverage in the press. I'm sure some of you remember. At that time, news reports like this were circulated in the media. The protagonist of the event is an 87-year-old patient with a history of seizures. Brain activities were being continuously monitored at a hospital in Canada with an electroencephalography, or in short, a device called an EEG. His heart stopped while he was connected to that very device. This is an unfortunate event, but scientifically very valuable, because this is one of the first instances where an EEG recording was taken continuously during those first seconds leading to death in a human brain. So what do the doctors see in those recordings? You know that famous scene from the movies? The line on the monitor goes flat, and then a sound like this is heard. Of course, such a moment never happened, because this flat line is about the heart stopping. However, scientists expected a similar picture for brain signals too. Right after the heart stops, the EEG recording that measures brain waves should also turn into that flat line. But the exact opposite happened. Just before and right after the heart stopped, the brain seemed to come alive for a brief moment one last time. There was a remarkable increase in gamma waves. Other waves, like alpha, were also increasing. Moreover, the frequency increase wasn't just random. It was surprisingly regular. Gamma waves aren't just ordinary signals. They become prominent during moments of deep concentration, while meditating, dreaming, or recalling a memory from the depths of your mind. So in those final moments, a dying brain seems to bring back its most vivid memories once again. It's as if it's dreaming one last time. And that's the reason for those headlines we see in the press. So is this just speculation? Not exactly. In the article published on the subject in 2022, the research team pointed to exactly this possibility. The neurosurgeon leading the study, Dr. Jamal Zemar, made the following comment. The brain might be doing a kind of memory replay in its final moments. In other words, it could be reviewing the most important moments of its life once more, just as described in near-death experiences. Of course, there are still many question marks. After all, we're talking about a patient with a history of seizures. Some researchers say such behaviors can occur in a brain that experiences seizures until the moment of death. Actually, these kinds of observations aren't new. In the early 2000s, intensive care doctor Lakmir Chawla noticed something interesting while monitoring critical patients. In some patients, when the heart stops, there's a brief spike in the EEG. then the signal would fade away. In 2009, new data was published on 7 patients who were taken off life support. Brief increases in electrical activity were reported along with the heart stopping. Afterwards, data began to come in from larger groups of patients. In 2017, a similar pattern was observed in 35 dying patients. But the difference with the 2022 event is this: for the first time, such a continuous recording was obtained at the moment of death. In other words, the process was monitored from start to finish. Moreover, while previous reports spoke of a general increase, this recording clearly showed which waves rose, when, and in what pattern. There are also controlled experiments that support all this data. One of the most notable studies in this field was actually conducted at the University of Michigan in 2013, years before that famous 2022 case. Scientists, led by Jim O'Borgigan, sought the answer to the following question: how does a healthy mammalian brain behave at the moment of death? To find out, they designed an experiment on rats. Electrodes were placed in the brains of rats under anesthesia. Then, their hearts were stopped in a controlled manner. Do you know what was observed in their brain activity? A strong and regular gamma surge. Moreover, in some measurements, these waves appeared even more regular and powerful than during wakefulness. Look, these findings are very important because the signals weren't from a damaged brain like in 2022, but from a healthy mammalian brain. Of course, this doesn't mean that every dying brain experiences a final flare-up without exception. For the sake of scientific integrity, we must state this. For example, even in Dr. Chawla's 2017 human observations, this surge was seen in some of the patients studied, while it was not seen in others. Scientists still do not fully understand the reasons for this difference. But even the fact that this kind of pattern has been shown in some cases was enough to shake that old idea of a machine being unplugged. So scientists are no longer saying this is just a hallucination. They are asking why and how the brain produces such an organized hallucination. Both the clues in the human brain and the controlled evidence in animals point to the same thing. The brain doesn't always have to shut down quietly. So what does all this electrical activity, those gamma alpha bursts in the brain at the moment of death, mean for a person? I mean, is a conscious experience happening while all this is going on? Or does it mean nothing for the person who is dying? Well, science cannot answer this question alone, friends, because we can never know what those signals feel like just by looking at a device. We only have the stories of those who experienced that moment and somehow returned. Now let me introduce you to a neurosurgeon who has dedicated his life to science. This is the man, Dr. Eben Alexander. Throughout his career, he had heard stories of near-death experiences, but he saw them all as tricks the brain plays in difficult moments. To him, everything consisted of chemical and electrical signals in the brain. Consciousness was a product of the brain, and when the brain stopped, consciousness would vanish too. But in 2008, something happened to him that completely shattered this entire view. That year, Dr. Alexander was in a coma for a week due to a rare bacterial meningitis. But this was no ordinary coma. According to the reports of his colleagues who treated him, the neocortex region of his brain was severely damaged and disabled. We see dreams and hallucinations through this region in the brain. Therefore, Dr. Alexander could see neither dreams nor hallucinations in this state. So what did he feel then?
And then it was outside of this entire universe. All of higher dimensional space and time collapsed down in this gigantic, infinite black void that I call the core. And that was with that divine, all-loving, creative power, who many would call God.
Dr. Alexander woke up from that coma as a completely different person who no longer believed that everything was just about the brain. Of course, we are talking about the subjective experience of a single person here. No matter how impressive these narratives are, they are not scientific proof, but powerful testimony. Science does not consider such personal stories as evidence on their own. But when similar accounts come from people with different religions and beliefs all over the world, question marks inevitably arise. If all this is not just a simple hallucination, then what is actually happening in our brains? There are a few answers scientists have given to this question, but let me state it now. These are not scientific proof, just strong hypotheses trying to explain this mysterious phenomenon. The first and most powerful of these is directly related to gamma waves. The archive scanning hypothesis? If you recall, these waves are most active in the memory section of the brain. Well, according to this hypothesis, with that final burst, the brain is actually performing a massive archive scan. In other words, just before death, it takes one last trip at the speed of light through that massive library of every memory and every emotion recorded up to that day. According to this hypothesis, that famous life review is actually like a farewell film the brain prepares for itself. But why would the brain do such a thing in its final moments? Why would it waste its last bit of energy replaying the past? Well, that's where another hypothesis comes into play. The brain's protective simulation hypothesis. According to this view, the brain isn't just an archivist. It also acts as a shield, protecting us from the greatest traumas. For instance, in a life-threatening accident, time seems to slow down. Or when we feel intense pain, the brain releases its own painkillers. This hypothesis suggests that the moment of absolute extinction is the greatest trauma consciousness can experience. And the brain steps in one last time to protect consciousness from this trauma. It cuts all ties with the outside world and, in those final moments, places the person into a peaceful, meaningful, and loving virtual reality, a final dream. Actually, there's an even more fundamental hypothesis that could explain this peaceful experience, the neurochemical storm hypothesis. According to this view, when the brain faces death, it secretes a kind of chemical cocktail to survive and manage the process. Within this, there are a few key players that could explain those famous experiences reported in near-death encounters. First, there are endorphins. These are the body's own natural painkillers. They're many times more powerful than even synthetic morphine. For example, this is why we don't initially feel pain during a serious accident despite having a broken bone. So it takes the stage during the brain's toughest moments. Now let's think. What is the most traumatic, most stressful moment a body can experience? The moment of death, of course. So in those moments, the brain might be activating endorphins to avoid pain. The second, and perhaps most key player, is serotonin, which we all know is the happiness hormone. However, in the final moments, its role goes far beyond just providing happiness. Serotonin is one of the architects of our perception of reality. Scientists say that a surge in serotonin while dying can alter the perception of time and space. So this could be the reason for vivid visual experiences like a tunnel or a bright light. Within this cocktail, there's also a controversial molecule, DMT. It's also known in popular culture as the spirit molecule. This substance can indeed induce experiences very similar to near-death experiences. Animal experiments have shown that DMT levels in the brain increase at the moment of death. However, the scientific community is very cautious about this because it hasn't been proven yet that the same increase occurs in humans. And whether DMT alone can create such a complex experience is still a big question mark. But what if all these experiences are more than just the brain simulation or memory recall? Well, that's where another hypothesis comes before us. The consciousness and antenna hypothesis. What if our brain isn't an organ that produces consciousness, but a biological receiver that captures it from the universe itself? So if it's just a kind of antenna. According to this hypothesis, what we call consciousness could be a fundamental property that's always existed in the fabric of the universe, just like television signals. It might sound like a strange idea, but modern physics itself actually tells us that the universe is even stranger than that. For example, let's consider the principle of quantum entanglement. Two entangled particles. Even if they're as far apart as the other end of the universe, they don't break their connection with each other. It's as if there's an invisible bond between them, independent of time and space. And this hypothesis asks this. What if consciousness also has such an entangled structure between that biological machine in our brain and the fabric of the universe? When a TV antenna breaks, the broadcast itself doesn't disappear, right? Only the image is lost. So that final gamma burst could be that strong static an antenna makes as it loses its signal when it's unplugged. Like the brain receiving a signal from a supposed field of consciousness one last time. Let me repeat, these aren't proven facts. They're hypotheses wandering on the edges of science. Still, they offer us a thought-provoking framework for why such organized activity occurs in the brain's final moments. So the brain's final farewell might not be just a simple shutdown. We're talking about a process full of mysteries, complex yet equally organized. So what does all this mean for us? Could this new understanding make us question our most basic assumptions, even our most sensitive decisions? For example, the definition of death might no longer be as sharp a line as it used to be. The possibility that consciousness could still exist in that gray area between the moments the heart stops and the brain goes silent could raise deep ethical questions, especially in critical matters like organ donation. How will we be sure exactly when a body's journey has come to an end? Of course, these decisions are made with doctors' strict protocols and legal definitions. But we can't ignore these new questions opened up by scientific findings either. This new understanding could touch all our lives, not just doctors. For example, talking at the bedside of a patient said to be unconscious, holding their hand, playing the music we love. Maybe these aren't just one-sided actions we do just to make ourselves feel better. Maybe in those final moments, during that gamma burst, our voice, our touch, is becoming a part of that internal experience. All this brings us back to this question. If the brain can behave so organized and meaningfully, even in its most vulnerable state, maybe what we call consciousness isn't just something that's born and dies inside the brain as we thought. Maybe it really is a fundamental property of the universe, and the brain is just a receiver that catches it for a while. Remember, the consciousness and antenna hypothesis suggests this. So here we are again at the boundaries of science. That is, at that most exciting moment where science and philosophy intersect. Betelgeuse will shine one last time as it dies. We don't know when. Maybe in 50 years or maybe in 100,000 years. But there's one thing we know. As it disperses at the end of its life, it will simultaneously scatter the seeds of new worlds around it. And such massive stars, at the end of their lives, turn into either a neutron star or a black hole. Black hole. Of information, a moment of transformation where energy passes from one form to another that we cannot yet understand. A singularity where time and space lose their meaning. Who knows, maybe our farewell's like this too. One last glow, and then an invisible boundary. We don't know if beyond that boundary is darkness or a different kind of light hidden from us. But as Carl Sagan said, we are star stuff. Our origin is one. So, could our destiny be one too?